And now that we are done now that we have started recording, I'll try to give you some announcements. Least important first. Hopefully, I have to have it already prioritize them, but since it's early, I don't want to give anything too important yet. Maybe some reminders that I've been saying all semester, like get independent work done. We're running out of time, right? We only have a few weeks left. So if you haven't done independent work, and judging by the names off the top of my head, I think I'm preaching to the choir currently. But anyway, yeah, make sure you get independent work done. Um, Speaking of which, I've always said that you can go back and fix old mistakes on labs, and that you can, even if you didn't do a lab, you can turn it in late, all for partial credit. That's still the case, but like I said from the beginning, um, it's all a matter of prioritizing, right? So I'm not guaranteeing that I can grade old stuff. So if you fixed an old lab, or turned in an old lab, or turned in some old attendance, I can't guarantee you I'll have time to take care of it. So if you're looking for the biggest bang for your buck for points, other than staying on top of what's currently due, like the labs, attendance, stuff moving forward. Other than that, you can get the most points by fixing old exams. So I would prioritize that. And then beyond that, I would prioritize getting that independent work done. Because when you think about it, a lab is worth 20 points. So if you just didn't do a lab at all and you turned it in late, the most you can get is 10 points. And 10 points is less than a page of independent work. So really, again, your biggest bang for your buck would be independent work more than turning in old labs. And I hate to say that, because I prefer you to do the labs and get the experience from it and the education from it. But I'm also being realistic here, and I know some of you need to pass and are very far from it. So I'm really just giving you the shortcuts on how to do that. So any questions about that? Excuse me. As of yesterday, I was officially negative for COVID. So starting on Monday, we'll be back in person for lecture and lab. Again, this is one of those labs, hopefully you've looked at it, that's virtual. So again, I would say you can go ahead and do it if you want. And if you do and you do a good grade, there's a possibility I might personally tell you don't need to come into lab next week. But so again, there's that possibility. But otherwise, go ahead and plan on being in lab, and go ahead and plan on bringing your computer. I don't think it's that complicated, but everybody's different. So any questions about lab or lecture next week? All right. I can't think of any other really important announcements. I would say again, like I've been reiterating all semester, if you're failing, now's the time to try to fix it. I mean, at this point, honestly, if it's almost too late, I hate to say that too, but you can't drop the class, so you might as well put in the effort. So anyway, before we get started on the next chapters, anybody have any questions? All right, nice and easy. Let me remind you that since I'm teaching from home, there is going to be probably some background noise, and I apologize. Let me share my screen here, and we'll get started. Another thing to remind you is that because we are a little bit behind, I'm going to go through these very quickly. So feel free to stop me or slow me down, or after a class say, hey, you went through that section really quickly. Can you re-explain it? Meet me online for office hours to do that. I would be glad to do that. Anyway, here we are. We're going from chapter 20. So pay attention here. Notice we went from chapter 13 to chapter 20. Obviously, we skipped a lot. So when you're studying your textbook, make sure you're studying the correct chapters. And again, the last 3 chapters that are going to be on the final exam are chapters 13 that we just finished, chapter 20 that we're doing now, and then chapter 21. So your final exam is going to consist of half of about 50 questions of chapters 13, 20, and 21. And then half the questions will be from your first 3 exams. So here we go. Let's jump into it. In my opinion, this should be a lot easier. even starting from the last chapter, chapter 13, it's not as easy as the rest of them, or as the rest of the two that we're about to do. But, and I don't remember if I mentioned this when we started chapter 13, but this is the point in the semester where we're no longer looking at cells, right? We're not looking at cellular processes like mitosis and meiosis and photosynthesis and respiration. Now we're looking at the big picture. We're looking at how things interact with each other. And in my opinion, that's just easier. And I hope it is for you too. Specifically for this chapter is communities and ecosystems. And you don't know what a community or an ecosystem is yet. Well, at least I haven't taught you, but you will soon. So here we go. This chapter is broken down into 4 main bullet points. And the first word for attendance is going to be community. Anyway, the first thing we're talking about is biodiversity. And this is such an important topic, not even necessarily for the exam, just for everyday life. For any of you who've had my 108 class, or maybe you will have it on some other day, to me, in my opinion, this is one of the most important things you can learn in that class, because it's one of the more important things to understand about the environment. And I wish I had more time to talk about it. I could go on and on about why it's so important, but I'll just teach you what the book teaches you and leave it at that. So, what is biodiversity? You definitely need to know this for the exam. Does anybody have any guesses? Like, what do you think of as biodiversity? Since you haven't had this class yet, when you think of the word biodiversity, what do you think of? Any guesses? Nobody? All right. It's basically the variety of living things. It's in the name, right? Bio is life, right? And diversity is, a variety. So when you think about like workplace diversity, when you hear people using those terms, they usually mean a variety of employees, right? Whether that means a variety of ages, a variety, a good balance of the two sexes, or variety of ethnicities, whatever it may be, right? So that's what we think of as diversity. So with biodiversity, we're talking about the same thing, except we're specifically talking about living things. Of course, it can't be just that easy, so we have to make it a little bit more difficult. So yes, you do need to know that biodiversity is the variety of living things. You also need to know that it's broken down into 3 different types: genetic, species, and ecosystem. And we're going to talk about each of these 3 separately, which is why I'm not going to talk about them right now. But everybody learns different. But for me, if I was studying this, the first thing I would learn is the definition of biodiversity. And then I would memorize these 3 sub categories of biodiversity. Excuse me. And then once I had these 3 subcategories memorized by name, then I would go on to understand what they mean. So, any questions so far? Okay. The first one, obviously, that we're going to talk about is genetic diversity. And this hopefully is in the name, genetic diversity. And it really is a good segue into or basically a good, from what we last talked about, right? So one of the last things we talked about in the last chapter was the gene pool, right? We talked about microevolution, where certainly some alleles would go up, some alleles would go down. Certain genotypes would go up, certain genotypes would go down, right? So that's sort of what we were talking about. Genetic diversity obviously is in a population. That's the first thing you need to know about genetic diversity. If we're talking about genetic diversity, we are talking about a population. So remember, a population is a group of the same species, right? They're in the same area, they're interbreeding with each other, they're dealing with the same factors, right? And they're competing for the same resources, all that stuff. So when we're talking about genetic diversity, we're talking about a population. And it's basically just the variation in alleles. So again, we did that. Think if you can picture the last lecture we did, and I had that picture of the white flowers and the red flowers for generation 1, and then generation 2, and then generation 3. And that the example was for that one was genetic drift, like the change in the alleles, the change in the gene pool by chance, right? There was no advantage to being red, there was no advantage to being white. So, but by chance, over time, it went from a mixture of red and white flowers to a population of completely red flowers, right? Because that white allele it just disappeared by chance. So in that case, biodiversity went down, right? Because the variations in alleles went down because we completely lost an allele. It is the raw material that makes microevolution and adaptation possible. We've already mentioned that in chapter 8. So again, for focusing on this chapter, on this slide, when it comes to the exam, again, when you think of genetic diversity, you should think of a population, and you should think of alleles, right? It's the variation in alleles. So for the exam, for this specific conversation, these two are the more important bullet points. And again, this bullet point we already mentioned in chapter 8. Anyway, and I'm not going to necessarily ask you this. This is kind of talking about why it's important, and I mentioned it before. But if a whole population is lost, then the number of individuals in a species declines, obviously, right? And the genetic resources for that species declines, and this also threatens the survival of species. So again, I'll just really quickly just say the same example, or repeat the same example I gave in the last lecture when we were talking about alleles and their variations, and how having variation is good for the survival of your species. And I think the example I gave was something like, imagine if in World War II, and a lot of people died in World War II, don't get me wrong, but imagine if even more people died, like, right? Imagine if most of the human race died in World War II and only a few people were left. Well, relatively few people left. And let's just say by chance, everybody who died carried the allele, or the alleles, whatever it may be, that make us less susceptible to COVID, right? So obviously there's a lot, COVID's really complicated, but there is a genetic component. So to simplify it, let's just say it's completely genetic, right? Some people have the genes to be completely immune to it. Some people have the genes where it kills you if you have it. Some people have the genes where if you get it, it affects you, but you're not going to die from it, right? So imagine if those alleles have been, and I'm sure they have, but imagine those alleles have been in the human population forever, and we somehow by chance lost them all in World War II, right? So because we lost so many individuals in our species, right? Because we lost so many individuals in our species, that means we lost those alleles, right? So in other words, our genetic resources declined, and that would threaten the survival of the species. Because imagine if every human on Earth, and again, I'm oversimplifying, but imagine if every human on Earth living today was susceptible to COVID, to the fact where, to the way it would kill them, just like it has killed some people, right? Imagine if it killed everybody that way. Then the human population would, again, be decimated a couple of years ago. But anyway, that's genetic diversity. Any questions about genetic diversity? All right. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I should have even wasted my time giving you my example. I could have given you a book example. And we're getting to that, but there's another word your book talks about, and I'm probably not going to ask you about it. But your book points out that genetic diversity not only is important just for survival, but it's also important for economic reasons, right? So even for us, we humans, we have economic value. And the example your book is giving is something called bioprospecting, which is the potential development of new medicines, industrial chemicals, and other products. And then that in itself is not directly tied to genetic diversity, but what is directly tied to genetic diversity is this example I'm going to give you, because bioprospecting can save the food supply. And the example I'm going to give you is about this food supply is about genetic diversity. So there's something called the Cavendish banana. That's what you see right here. And you might not know this, and you can look it up for independent work. But when you go to the grocery store and see a banana, that's it. That's what you're seeing is a Cavendish banana. Unlike, apples, when you go to the store, there's all kinds of different apples, right? But with Cavendish bananas, that's the only variety you see, because pretty much everything else was wiped out, right? And also another thing about these Cavendish bananas is that they are all clones. So genetically, if you were to look at their genomes, they are all the same. Every banana that you buy here, every banana that you buy in Canada, every banana that you buy in Thailand or Australia, they're all clones. So obviously, when we're talking about genetic diversity, there is none, right? It's all the same exact genome. Therefore, if there's a pathogen or a disease, right? If there's a disease that would kill one banana tree, that means it could potentially kill them all, because genetically they are all the same. Of course, we know from previous chapters that it's not all genetics, right? We know that's the environment and genetics mixed, but for the sake of this discussion, we're focusing on the genetics. So again, that's why it's so important. And not only is that possible, it has happened, right? There is a pathogen. I believe it's a virus. I don't remember for sure. You can look it up for independent work, but one has emerged So there is a virus out there. It is killing banana plants. And last time I heard there was no cure for it. And again, because bananas are clones, because there's zero genetic diversity, um, that's not good for us, right? Because we could lose all of our bananas. So that goes back to that whole bioprospecting thing. Because what they're doing is they're looking at wild bananas, right? Not the kind, like basically banana plants that aren't producing the kind of bananas we would want to eat, but they're still the same species. They just happen to have different genomes. So scientists are looking at those genomes to hopefully find some alleles that'll make them immune to this upcoming banana disease. Let me put a big X to this only because I just want to indicate this is just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about bananas on the final. But are there any questions about this example? Okay, again, in my opinion, this is a decent independent work topic. It's at least slightly interesting. Also, and I don't remember for sure. You can look this up for independent work too. I think, and this may be a rumor, but I think that the banana flavor, like when you have like banana flavored candy or something like that, you know how it never tastes like bananas. Well, there's a rumor that the reason that it tastes like that is because that flavor is based on a banana variety that has gone extinct, right? So again, now it's only Cavendish, but there used to be other varieties, and I forget what it's called. Anyway, you can look it up for independent work if you want. So that's it for genetic diversity. So again, for the genetic diversity, we're looking at a single population, and we're looking at the gene pool, basically, right? The variety of alleles. Now we're going a step up and talking about species diversity. This should be pretty simple. It's in the name. Before we talk about it, your book gives a little introduction. So will I. And your book points out that we humans are pushing all species, species in general, all living things on Earth towards extinction. Specifically, the present rate is 100 times higher than any time in the past 100,000 years. You don't need to know that. This is just an introduction to talk about species diversity. Also, I should point out that there have been other mass extinction events. So yes, we're probably going into a mass extinction event. And yes, you probably know about the dinosaurs mass extinction events. But there were other ones, and you can look that up for independent work too. How many mass extinction events have there been? Are we in the next mass extinction event? If not, how close are we? And how do you define it? Like how many species need to die before it's considered a mass extinction event? The next word for attendance is going to be here. I'm going to circle it. I'm not going to say it. So if you're listening calmly with your eyes closed, open them up and look at the word that was circled. Oh yeah, I'll remind you, send these words in by 9 a.m. Anyway, going back to this. At the current rate, over half of all plant and animal species may be gone by the end of the century. So that's what your book says. Again, I'm not going to ask you any of this. And also keep in mind when this is a lot of speculation, right? Because it's really hard to say that with a great degree of accuracy. Plus, this book I think was published in 2016. So, both bullet points are things worth looking up for independent work. Yes, I've just given you this information, but you could look it up yourself and either confirm this, or you can say, well, yeah, that's what they used to think, but now they think differently. Or yes, that's what a majority of the scientists think, but a few of them think differently, and that could be your independent work. Anyway, again, this is just the introduction to talking about what you need to know, which is species diversity. Good grief. Let me give you some more examples. Here's an example from your book about a species that's recently gone extinct. It's called the Hector's dolphin. Oh, excuse me, it's endangered. There's the Hector's dolphin. It's just an example. I'm not going to ask you about this. I'm not going to ask you any examples about species that are going extinct or that are extinct. You can look it up for independent work if you want, but no questions on the exam. Here's a really interesting one. I love this. The Formosan clouded leopard at the time that this book was published was considered extinct. And I'm like 98% sure, and you can check me for independent work. I'm 98% sure that they have found another one in the wild. So it turns out that they are not extinct. Obviously very close though, because, it's really close to being extinct. Again, just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about that on the exam. And then I wanted to look up some other examples that were not in your book. And obviously, I'm really, really not going to ask you about this on the exam because it's not even in your book. The West African black rhinoceros at the time that I made this PowerPoint was the most recent extinction that we knew of. And then I chose a passenger pigeon because that is one of the more famous examples of a species in the United States that has gone extinct. And then the Carolina parakeet, and that's an example of a species that has gone extinct in West Virginia. So if you download the PowerPoint, you can see you can click any of these, either three of these, and watch a short little video about those. And if you want to, you can watch them and then summarize them for independent work if you're interested. More stats that you don't need to know. But the current assessment, about 13% of the 10,000 bird and about a quarter of the 5,488 mammal species are threatened with extinction, right? So again, big numbers. The point here is this is important. Your book also points out that over 20% of freshwater fish have become extinct during human history, or at least seriously threatened. And keep in mind here, we're talking about species. So we're not talking about like, we used to have 500,000 largemouth bass in West Virginia, and now we only have 50,000 largemouth bass in West Virginia. That's the numbers I'm making up. But I'm not talking about the number of individuals in a species. I'm talking about species themselves, right? So of all the different species that have ever existed of fish, and I'm just focusing on this because it's the last one I said, we've lost over 20% of them. The not the whole number of fish in general, but the species, that's even bigger. Anyway, moving on. About 41% of amphibians are now threatened with extinction, and of the about 20,000 plant species in the United States, 200 of them have become extinct, and over 10,000 plant species worldwide are threatened with extinction. So I'm going to put a big old X through this, just to remind you that I'm not going to ask you about those numbers, but obviously it's a big deal. And I don't think, one sec, give me a second. Yeah. So I guess in hindsight, nowhere in this discussion of species diversity is there a slide that actually spells it out for you in writing. So I'll go ahead and tell you. Species diversity is just obviously the number of species, right? The number of species on Earth. So that's another thing you could look up for independent work. It's a tangent, but you could look it up. How many species are there on Earth? It'd have to be an estimate because sometimes things go extinct without us knowing. Sometimes there's other species we haven't discovered yet, but you can get a good estimate. So anyway, again, backing it up, looking at the big picture. When we're talking about biodiversity in general, the first thing we talked about was genetic diversity, and that's when we were looking at a single population, right? We were looking at one single species, and we were saying, it's the gene pool, the variation in alleles in that one species, that one population. Then we get to a step up, which is species diversity, right? So that's talking about all the different species on Earth. So any questions about species diversity? All right. The next thing we're talking about is ecosystem diversity. And this is so hard to teach in a way because the way your book lays this out, it would be better if you had more of an understanding of what an ecosystem is. Is this the first time I'm teaching you what an ecosystem is? And then later on, we're really going to go into depth about what an ecosystem is. But here we go. What is an ecosystem? An ecosystem includes organisms and the abiotic factors in a particular area. So, there's not necessarily any reason to write this down because in a different chapter, I'm going to give you a better definition and talk about it more. But for now, here's what you need to think of when you think of a species. First of all, you already need to know what a population is. And I told you that's a group of individuals of the same species that are living in the same area, right? They're dealing with the same factors. They're competing for the same resources, right? So an example I've already given is the squirrels on WVSU's campus, right? That is a population. A step up from a population is something called a community. I'm going to teach you about that later. But a community isn't just one species living in the same area, dealing with the same factors and competing for the same resources. A community is all the different species, right? So not just the squirrels on WVSU's campus, but the humans that they've got to dodge, like for their cars, the cats that are trying to eat the squirrels, the trees that that they live in and they get food from, the grass, every living thing on WVSU's campus would be a community. And then a step up from that is an ecosystem, And as far as this particular conversation about biodiversity is concerned, in a sense, community and ecosystem are the same. But again, a community is all the living things, right? All the different species, all the different populations living in an area. And an ecosystem is the same thing, except now with an ecosystem, you also consider the non-living factors, like how hot does it get, how cold does it get, how much rain does it get, what's the pH of the soil, all that stuff. So again, for this conversation, for ecosystem diversity, when you think of an ecosystem, you should just think about maybe just like a little environment, right? How things all work together, all the different living creatures and how they interact with each other and how they interact with the environment. That's what an ecosystem is. Anyway, um, so because of that, right? Because it's such an intricate web of interactions that you're going to learn more about later, oddly enough, um, the loss of one species can have a negative effect on the entire ecosystem. Let me see. I think I have an example. No, not yet. Anyway, I guess just to give you a quick example, if all the oak trees on WVSU's campus went extinct, if we lost all that species, that would have a negative effect on the entire ecosystem because those oak trees provide shade, and there's only certain grasses that can live in the shade, and those oak trees provide food and shelter for the squirrels. So without that, the squirrels wouldn't have a place to live, and then the things that eat the squirrels, if the squirrels are gone, then they die because they don't have anything to eat, right? So on and so forth. Um, and I might ask you this. I'm going to teach you this. I'm going to teach you more about this later. So for now, it's just an introduction. But the question is, why is this important? What do we care about ecosystems? Because there's something called ecosystem services. And before I read through all this, long story short, ecosystem services, most importantly, those are the things that keep us alive. So without ecosystem services, we would just be dead, ultimately. And also, I guess also very important, but not as important as life or death, is ecosystem services are also worth money. So, for example, plants clean the air and the water, and if you've ever bought a water purifier or an air purifier, you know that costs money, right? Climate regulation, right? So running an air conditioner, running a heater, that costs money, but again, ecosystems help do that too, but obviously on a bigger scope. Erosion control, these are all just examples, so you don't necessarily need to know them. But erosion control is another thing. And as you might know, like, I don't even have time to get into it, but it costs a lot of money to prevent erosion on your property, for example. So again, I'm saying ecosystem services, it's a matter of life and death, is because it's what nature provides us, right? So without oxygen, without food, without water, we would die. But also, again, it's actually worth money. And then your book also gives some specific examples. For example, forests' ability to absorb and store carbon. Coral reefs provide food, they provide storm protection, and they provide recreation. I used to live in the Florida Keys, so this one's a little bit more relevant to me because yes, a lot of food was caught off those coral reefs and brought back to land, and we could eat it. When hurricanes come, yes, they are deadly, but they'd be even more deadly if we didn't have those coral reefs to slow down the storm surge. And recreation, this is the big one. So the same way West Virginia is obsessed with coal mining, and the Florida Keys, they're obsessed with the coral reefs because that's the entire economy is people coming in to scuba dive and snorkel and see the coral or fish and participate with the coral reefs. Anyway, to back it all up before I go forward, what you need to know from this slide, even though I'm going to teach it in a later chapter, is what an ecosystem service is. An ecosystem services are functions performed by an ecosystem that directly or indirectly benefit people. So again, ultimately, we're talking about ecosystem diversity. So this slide doesn't even teach you about ecosystem diversity. This is more like telling you why it's important. And then your book gets even more specific. So coral reefs are rich in species diversity, yet about 20% of them have been destroyed by humans. And 75% are threatened, and that number is expected to top 90% by 2030 if current abuses continue. And again, I'm just putting an X through there to remind you that this is just an example. I'm not going to ask any specific questions about numbers. And also, I'll remind you that this book was published, I think, in at 2016. So again, these are numbers that you can double check. Look them up for independent work and see how they've changed. See how the projections have changed, if at all. Any questions about this slide? All right, the next word for attendance will be fish, since there's a bunch of fish on the slide there. All right, so again, now we know the three different types of biodiversity, right? So it gets very specific, which is genetic diversity, right? We're looking at the gene pool of a single population, and then you spread it out and talk about the species diversity. So that's all the different species on Earth. And then you get even bigger, and you look at all the different ecosystems. And your book didn't explicitly state this, or at least I didn't in the PowerPoint. So again, another way of looking at ecosystem diversity really quickly is think about all the different types of ecosystems. Even though I haven't taught them to you yet, you could think like, the wetlands off the coast of Myrtle Beach, right? That area between the beach and the mainland, that you have to cross the bridge over. That's a specific ecosystem, right? With specific types of plants and specific types of animals. Then if you go, 10 miles to the east, then you're dealing with a completely different ecosystem. Then you're talking about an open ocean ecosystem and really deep water. And then you have the ecosystems where we live, which is basically like a mountainous forest, right? Or ecosystems in the desert, or ecosystems in Alaska, right? So think about all these different places on Earth. Those are all different types of ecosystems. And we need them all to function. Anyway, really quickly, let's talk about clauses of declining biodiversity. You do need to know this for the exam. And I know one of you's had Bio 108, so this should be a review for you. But there are four main factors. You don't need to write them down yet because we're going to talk about them individually. But they are habitat destruction and fragmentation, invasive species, over exploitation, and pollution. So again, we're going to talk about those separately. But first, a little introduction from your book. The expanding size and dominance of the human population is the root of all four factors, right? So all these four things that are happening is obviously because of humans. And not just the fact that we exist, but the fact that we exist in such high numbers, and because we're so powerful, basically, right? So no other species on Earth has ever changed the face of Earth like we have. As a matter of fact, there's a good documentary that I've already posted, at the beginning of the semester on Google Classroom that you can watch for independent work about this. I might share it later today, and you can watch it for independent work if you want. Anyway, the first thing we're going to talk about is habitat destruction. Habitat destruction and fragmentation is from a number of things. You don't necessarily need to write these down. This is just scratching the surface, but agriculture destroys habitats, urban development, forestry, mining, right? All these things destroy habitats. And I want to point this out too. For the most part, we have to do these things, right? We have to destroy habitats for humans to survive because we need food. We need places to put our houses. We need things to build our houses with. We need a way to give ourselves electricity, right? So all these things, yes, they're bad for the environment, but and I try to reiterate this a lot in my other class, but I'm not sitting here telling you, hey, it's bad for the environment, you shouldn't do it. I'm not saying that. It's just that it's more like, all right, you should at least be aware of what's good and what's bad for the environment, right? And this is bad for the environment. This is bad for ecosystems. But again, we have to do these things. Of course, we should try to minimize it, right? So let's try not to waste food, and let's try not to sprawl too much, and maybe keep our homes at a modest size and maybe not use as much electricity. But anyway, that's what habitat and destruction and fragmentation is from. Again, there's other things that it's from, and you can look it up for independent work, right? Here's a list of 4 things. What are some other things that are responsible for habitat destruction and fragmentation? And then here's the important part as far as the exam is concerned. Habitat destruction and fragmentation is the greatest threat to biodiversity, which is why it's listed first. I'm not going to ask you these specifics, but your book points out that it affects over 85% of birds, mammals, amphibians, that are threatened with extinction. So again, on this slide, the most important thing as far as the exam is concerned is that habitat destruction is the greatest threat to biodiversity. And I will also point out, to help you remember this, let me back up and then we'll come back to this. The other things, in a sense, all come back to habitat destruction, right? If you have an invasive species, it's bad because it destroys the habitat. If you have over exploitation, which is like when you just take too much, right? Take too many fish, or you cut down too many trees, whatever, that's going to be destroying the habitat. If you pollute stuff, that's going to destroy the habitat. So on the exam, when you're trying to remember, oh, which one was the worst, remember all three of these things lead up to that habitat destruction, which is the greatest threat to biodiversity. Anyway, are there any questions about habitat destruction? Okay. Let's talk about invasive species. I'm going to go through this very quickly because it's very obvious. It's a very straightforward concept. Um, it is the second greatest threat to biodiversity. I'll put a question on next to that, meaning I'm not sure I'm going to necessarily ask you that. I'm definitely going to ask you what the greatest threat is. I don't think I'm going to ask you to prioritize the other ones. But anyway, what is an invasive species? It's an invasive species that competes with a native species or preys upon the native species or parasitizes a native species. So I just want to be really clear here, not necessarily just for the exam, but for your own understanding. The name invasive species, yes, it does kind of sound like, oh yeah, that's basically a species that's not from here. And that's only half of the story, right? It also needs to be bad, basically. So, for example, if I were to take if someone had a pet alligator and dropped it off in northern Alaska, it's like, oh, be free, little boots, right? It said, and just let it free. It's probably not going to compete with a native species or prey on them or parasitize them because alligators can't survive in that environment. So they would just die, or an alligator would just die right away. I won't take questions yet because there's a little bit more to talk about for invasive species. Oh, and I will say this. I'm not going to ask you these three things specifically. Again, I just paraphrase it. What you need to know is an invasive species. It can't just be a species that's not from the area. It also has to be doing harm. Oh, yeah. So that is it. We're going to talk about invasive species again in the next semester and go into more detail. But for now, are there any questions about invasive species? All right. The next thing we're going to talk about is overexploitation. This was the easiest, the most simple one to understand. Again, it's just when you're taking too much. Now, how do I define too much, or how does your book define it? Simply, it's when you are harvesting at rates that exceed the ability of the populations to rebound. So, again, when we're talking about fish, if you're catching fish and you're catching more, like let's say you catch 100 fish a year in some pond, but when they reproduce, they only produce 80 fish a year. That's too much, right? You're pulling more out than can be reproduced. So eventually you're going to run out. It's that simple, right? So yeah, that's basically what you need to know for the exam, and not necessarily even in those words, because it sounds all formal and could be confusing. Again, over exploitation is when you're using stuff quicker than it can be replenished. You can almost even think of it on an economic terms, like personal economics, right? If you are spending more money than you make, that is over exploitation of your bank account, right? Anyway, then your book gets into some examples I'm going to very quickly read, but I'm not necessarily going to ask you about. Excessive commercial harvesting, poaching, and sport hunting have greatly affected the populations of tigers, American bison, and Galapagos tortoises. And it also threatens rare trees such as mahogany and rosewood that provide valuable wood. So again, we're just taking things quicker than they can be replenished. Your book gives some examples of how it's happening and specifically what species it's affecting. But this is a great springboard for independent work, right? So what kind of excessive commercial harvesting have gone on? What kind of poaching? What kind of sport hunting? What other species other than these three for animals? What other plants other than these two, right? You can look that up, and we'll talk about it in more detail in the next chapter. The next word for attendance will be this one right here at the bottom right. I'm going to circle it. I'm not going to say it. That's the next word for attendance. So yeah, look that up for independent work if you want. What are some other examples of over exploitation? So any questions about that? Oh yeah, if you really want to dig deep into it, to me, this is an interesting topic, sport hunting. So about basically what we mean by sport hunting is we're not talking about hunting to eat. We're just talking about hunting for the sake of killing animals. And if you want to look into it, some of this can be controversial. I don't know. You guys are pretty young. You might not remember. There was some dentist who got famous years back because he went and killed was a lion. I don't remember. He killed something in Africa, and everybody got pissed off because he didn't need to kill it. He wasn't killing it for food. Anyway, there's places in Africa where you can go. It's basically like a nature preserve, and they're basically like pinned in animals, sort of kind of pinned in. But anyway, you can go pay money to kill these things, all these exotic animals. You can pay money to kill them. And on the surface, that sounds like a bad thing as far as we're talking when you think about overexploitation. But um, a lot of those companies, like they charge a lot of money, and the money you spend there also goes towards helping the wild population. So, like, again, they've got like these captive populations of rhinoceroses, for example, but they're also spending a lot of that money helping wild populations. So some people argue that sport hunting is actually helping overexploitation, and you can look into it for independent work if you want. All right, the last one when we're talking about the causes of declining biodiversity is pollution, and this is really, really simple. All right, we all know what pollution is, and your book doesn't even get that deep into it, so it makes it even easier. Air and water pollution are a contributing factor in declining populations of many species. And I like that your book only points out, or I think it's funny that they only point out air and water pollution because there's other types of pollution. If we had more time to go into it, and I might in the next chapter, there's also something called noise pollution, which generally people mean when they say that, that means their neighbors are playing music loud and they don't like it or something like that. But there is actually environmental ramifications to noise pollution and light pollution and things like that that I don't have time to get into. But let's get back to what your book is talking about, which is air and water pollution. I'm going to just put a big old X through this because I'm going to talk about it very quickly, but I'm not going to ask you any of these examples. And again, you all know what pollution is. So let's move forward. The global water cycle transports pollutants from terrestrial to aquatic ecosystems hundreds of miles away. This is kind of relevant to us, not for the exam, but for real life, right? So here I am in Scott Depot on top of a hill. If I dump a bunch of oil in my backyard instead of disposing it properly when I change my oil, when it rains this weekend as it's supposed to, that oil is going to get washed down the hill, down this little creek at the bottom of my hill, and I can see the Kanawha River from right where I am. So that'll go into the Kanawha River, which will go into the Ohio River, which will go into the Mississippi River, which will go into the Gulf of Mexico, which will go into the Atlantic Ocean, right? So I'm really far away from the ocean, but I can easily pollute it right here from where I am. And then that's just water pollution. Obviously, air pollution is even bigger as far as the ability to travel. Pollutants in the atmosphere are carried for thousands of miles and falling as acid precipitation. I put a star next to this because it's more than just acid rain and acid snow, right? It's also bad. For example, and you don't need to know this, coal burning power plants put out mercury, and it can travel really far in the air. And there's actually a problem in Florida where the mercury is coming back down, and it deposits itself into the Everglades, and that's killing people it's killing a lot of species. And to me, this is really interesting because, again, in West Virginia, we're all obsessed with coal mining because that's what keeps our economy going. But in Florida, it's all about tourism. So here in West Virginia, we're doing all these things and putting out these pollutants because that's what our economy depends on. But then down in Florida, what we're doing in West Virginia, amongst other things, obviously, is it's destroying our economy because it's destroying, our natural beauty in Florida. But anyway, any questions about this little slide about air and water pollution? None of which is going to be specific on the exam, at least not this slide. All right. We managed to get through the first main bullet point. Let's jump into the second main bullet point, which is community ecology. So remember, again, you already know what a population is. I've officially told you what a population is. And I told you to step up from that as a community. And I gave you a brief little description of what a community is. And then I went up, said a step up from that is an ecology, an ecosystem. But here we go. Now we're going to take a step back and officially talk about what a community is. A community is the assemblage of species living close enough together for potential interaction. You need to know that for the exam, not verbatim. You just need to understand, like, if I give you an example of, this, if I just describe some scenario, you should recognize it as a community. So if I say all the squirrels living on WVSU's campus, you should say, oh, that's a population. But if I say all the squirrels living on WVSU's campus and all the trees living on WVSU's campus and all the other mammals and birds, right? So if it's a bunch of different species living in the same area, dealing with the same things, competing for the same resources, that's a community. So again, it's a step up from a population. Any questions about what a community is? All right. Here's the picture from your book. I love this. This is such a great example of a community, right? So, because all right, well, you can stop here. Here we go. We have two of the same species of birds, right? So let's start with a pop. That's a population, right? Of course, that's probably not the whole population, but there you go. You've got two of the same species. They're in the same area, competing for the same resource. That's a population. But now we take a step back and look. Now we have there's a hyena, there's a zebra, there's a lion, right? Excuse me. There's also a third bird of the same species. But anyway, and here's right. So here's the grass that the zebra was eating, and now the lion's going to eat the zebra, and it's competing with the hyenas and the birds, right? And then once whatever's left of that thing is going to die, and it's going to fertilize that grass. And once these animals poop, that's going to fertilize the grass. And then again, another zebra is going to come in and eat it, right? That's a community. It's all this interactions between all these different species in the same area. And of course, if there was again, like your book doesn't point this out much yet, but they're all not only are they dealing with the same thing or competing for the same resources, but they're dealing with the same factors. So if there's a flood in this area, they're all dealing with the flood. If there's a wildfire, they're all dealing with the wildfire. If a bunch of humans come in and put up a resort, and destroy their habitat, they're all going to have to deal with that. But anyway, that's just I love that picture. It's a great example of a community because not only does it show a bunch of different species, but it shows them interacting with each other. So any questions about that picture? All right. You need to know about something called interspecific interactions. And hopefully it's in the word. Interspecific interactions are the interactions between species. And if I had space, I would even write in between different species just to make that clear. That's a little bit redundant, but I just want to make sure you understand. I'm saying interaction between different species. So if you have two lions competing for a dead zebra, that's not interspecific interactions because that's interactions between the same species. But if you have a lion competing with a hyena, competing with a vulture for that dead carcass, that would be interspecific interactions. And does anybody, hopefully I put in this picture, hopefully you guys recognize what it is. This red line here is I-64, Interstate 64. It's called an interstate because it goes in between different states. So if you can remember that an interstate takes you in between different states, then you can remember interspecific interactions are interactions between species. And then for some reason, the way your book lays it out, next chapter, I'm going to teach you something called intraspecific interactions, which are interactions between the same species. Like, again, the lion example that I just used. Anyway, any questions about the definition of interspecific interactions? All right. Well, let's make it a little bit harder. Can't be that easy. Interspecific reactions are classified according to how they affect those species involved. And there's no need to write this down yet, but really quickly, it can be negative, which is when it's bad for both species involved. It can be plus, which is where it's good for both species involved. And more often, it could be plus minus, which is where it helps one species and hurts another. And I'm not going to take questions on that, and I'm not going to even stay on this page. I'm going to go to the next one because I'm going to teach you a bunch of different interspecific interactions. Some of them are going to be negative, some of them are going to be plus, and some of them are going to be plus minus. And we're going to have words for them, so let's jump into it. The first one we want to talk about in general is just interspecific competition. So again, we're talking about interspecific interactions, and under that umbrella term, we have this. We have interspecific competition, which is what I'm about to teach you about. Then there's mutualism, predation, herbivory, parasites and pathogens, and commensalism. Interspecific competition, you need to know what this is. And it's in the name. It's competition between species. So again, backing up to that example I just used for that picture we saw. The lions competing with the hyena and the birds, the vultures, those were interspecific competitions because they're competing with each other. What I didn't mention, and let me take it a step back, I'm sorry. We're talking about interactions in general, so not necessarily specifically competitions, but interactions. Another example I could have given from that picture from interactions, again, I said, right, when the lions poop and all those animals poop, that poop is then going to fertilize the soil, and that's going to help the grass. So that is also an interspecific interaction, right? That's one species helping another. But anyway, which is different than specifically interspecific competition, which again is when two different species, or excuse me, different species are competing, right? And your book points out that the population growth of any population is limited by the population density of the competing species and the density of their own population, right? So basically, it's a like a game of numbers, right? The more you have, as far as interspecific competition is concerned, then the more you have in your population and the fewer they have in their population, the better off you are. Of course, that's a broad statement. It's not always true, but specifically regarding interspecific competition, it is. So that brings up the question: what determines if populations will compete? Right? What determines that the lions and the hyenas are competing? Right? Well, your book gives some examples. And the first thing you need to understand this, is something called ecological niche, or niche, depending on how you pronounce it. And you need to know what this is for the exam. That is an organism's total use of biotic and abiotic resources. So a niche is different than a habitat, right? Habitat is where they live, and a niche is basically what they do. What do they need to survive? Your book gives some examples. There might be questions on the study guide, but there are not questions on the exam. And let me just show you a picture, because if you don't know what a barnacle is, then these words aren't going to make any sense to you. So let me just jump straight to the picture. So there's two different species of these barnacles. These barnacles are things that live on rocks and boats and things like that, and they need water. Some of them can be drier longer than other ones. Specifically in this example, when we're looking at these two different genus of barnacles, these right here, these are better at being dry than these, right? The blue ones need more water than these little khaki colored ones, right? So when they're together, you know, these stay down here where they're getting more water, and these are up here, right? The Cathylamus, they are out competing those, and at least in this area, because these can't get dry. But these, the blue ones, are out competing those in this area where it's wet. However, somebody did an experiment and they got rid of all these, and what happened was, instead of these things just staying where they are, they spread down. Which is basically, they're just an experiment to show that this was interspecific competition. These two were competing with each other. That's why they were basically self-regulating and good grief, I'm hearing noise in the background. It's throwing me off. Self-segregating, if you will. And then once you get rid of that, then this thing takes over, and it does it takes over. Anyway, that's just an example. There's going to be no questions about that on the exam. And that is it for today. The last word for attendance is going to be coexist. Make sure you get those words in before 9 a.m. If you need any help from me, we're coming down to the wire. Meet me online for office hours at 9 a.m. and I'll be glad to help you with whatever you need help with. Anybody have any questions? All right. Everybody have a great weekend. I'm going to be catching up on labs. So if you have any labs that I haven't graded yet, that you haven't done yet, now's the time to do it. Michaela, did you have any questions?